In this lesson, we're going to learn mainly about the roles of women, Native Americans, and African Americans in the Revolution. Before we get to that, though, let's review some of what we learned yesterday. And that is that not all in the colonies wanted independence. There were two factions that would begin to be established. Those that wanted independence, the Patriots, and those that did not and who supported the king, the Loyalists. The Patriots controlled the provisional governments, and they fought in both the Continental Army, the Continental Militias, and partisan groups. The Patriots would benefit from their control of the provisional governments in the colonies. And once again, even though some Loyalists, or Tories as they were called, did feel a duty to support the king, many Loyalists weren't true Loyalists and just wanted to live their life without interference. This being one of the patriot symbols that was used during the war to instill fear in the British was the "Don't Tread on Me," known as the Gadsden flag. Now, we also learned about the Civil War that was in the Carolinas, that was fought between South Carolinians who were born and lived in South Carolina, those Tories in the upcountry, or Loyalists, and the Low Country Patriots. This fact that South Carolina had so many Loyalists resulted in a large number of battles being fought here, 137 Revolutionary War battles. Also, we were introduced to the Patriot partisan groups, which we have more to learn about, who they believed in the cause of the Continental Army, but not the tactics. The tactics of the Continental Army was like the British. You line up several hundred men in a field, march at each other, and shoot volleys back and forth at each other. And the better trained army, who, of course, has to have fearless bravery because you are watching people right next to you get shot down, they usually were the victor, those who could maintain the ranks. The Patriot partisan groups, they believed in guerrilla tactics, where they hid in the woods and attacked the British, which would maximize their effectiveness with small numbers and also minimize their casualties. Today's lesson is about women in the Revolution. Now, women would have many roles in the Revolution. Some women were patriots. Of course, some women were loyalists. But no matter what their affiliation politically, because that's kind of like a political affiliation, they would be affected. Now, many of the women in the low country and up country, which I'm here creating a woman here, they would take on non-traditional roles that they did not have during the war. So, whether they were a patriot or a loyalist, many of the women would take on non-traditional roles. Many of the low country women became the manager of the plantations. So while many of the upcountry women even though they didn't own a plantation, they would take on the duties of their husband, running the farm and doing his, job. So many of the women in the colonies would take on these non-traditional roles. And some women were patriots, some were loyalists, and some, didn't really want to be involved. What's the word that means you're not involved in the war? Yes, it's neutral. And if you would ask these women why they were actually involved or why they were having to take on these non-traditional roles, they'd probably say something along the lines as, well, my husband used to be the manager or do whatever job she is doing, but he's off fighting the war. Now, another thing that women were is some were messengers. Some also fought in the war, and we'll talk about that as well. So, and some of these women were spies or messengers outright to both the British and the Continental Army. Of course, probably more so the Continental Army is where they would be the messengers for. Many women took on the role that I know you barely saw, but let's recreate it here. Many women would do this job. I think I'm going to draw the mask first, and then we'll put the young lady in it. Yes, what I'm trying to draw is, of course, I'm trying to draw a mask. It's not like a beard. Many women were nurses in the war to take care of the wounded who had fallen in battle or been suffered some form of injury. And many women, even though it's not like a role, but many just sat by and watched their entire life, be it property or even their loved ones, be destroyed by the war. Many women sacrificed their homes and fortunes willingly or unwillingly, because the war would bring great destruction in South Carolina. Of course, this destruction, especially if it was headed up by the British, some of this caused people to want to join the partisan bands. I'm drawing a young lady who is watching her house be consumed by flames, which the British may have set on fire because they were known for doing that to the Patriots. Here are the PowerPoint slides for the roles of women in the Revolution. Women in South Carolina were patriots, some were loyalists, some did not wish to be involved and were neutral. They supported the war effort while men were fighting away. Many South Carolina women managed the farms and plantations. Here's a famous young lady who went out and fought right alongside the men, called Molly Pitcher. She fought during the Revolution. Many women also served as messengers or nurses, and many sacrificed or gave up their homes and fortunes. I'm actually related to this young lady, a direct descendant, although she's not young now, but I show you this for two reasons. One, to show a woman being involved in the war effort again, but this young lady was on the frontier, which was near the Ohio-West Virginia border, and there the war took on a different, a different picture than we're used to when we watch movies and shows about the Revolution. There, the fighting was between the people living in the frontier versus Native Americans who fought on the side of the British. And here it was a story, and like I said, I tell it because I'm related, where that young lady was here in this blockhouse, as it was called, and there was a fort that was running out of powder because they were under attack by the Native Americans who were on the side of the British, probably the Shawnee, as I've told many of you. I believe it was, mostly. And the only way to save the fort was to get more powder to it, which there was a lot in here. And she chose to run over and deliver it. So many women were very heroic during the war. This segment of the lesson leads to the role of Native Americans in the war with Britain for independence. As was just said, many of the Native American groups joined the British. The reason they joined the British is because the British basically promised the natives something they want very badly. What would the natives want very badly? Something that had been taken from them, perhaps. Yes, the British said that they will give back some of the land to the natives that was taken from them in the West. So, the natives chose to join the British in the Revolution. And that picture there was on the frontier in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where most of that fighting between the Native Americans and the colonials living there took place. And I made a little skit about this. At first, though, many of the natives were neutral. No war for us. For instance, the Cherokee would have kept the, what leader was the peace leader? Yes, maybe keep the white leader. But then, when the British promised that an alliance with them would result in land for them, they chose to bring up with, or they chose to join the British. And I think it was pretty much a solid consistent thing where the natives fought for the British. There may have been random scouts that were on the side of the Patriots, but natives as a whole fought for the British because they promised to give back land in the West. Information on that continues here, where Native Americans, at first, many tribes avoided the war, but colonists started to attack natives on the frontier, and the natives retaliated. Keep in mind, there's probably still scars from the Cherokee War that were in the colonists and both the natives' minds, so that as well as other things would cause the colonists to attack the natives. And the natives eventually supported the British since they promised control of Western land. Cherokees supported British and attacked the colonists, but eventually fled the state again due to the British losing the war. Oh, I forgot to tell that one of the things, some of the Western land that was promised to the natives was Ohio. Ohio and Kentucky were very important to the natives, and there was white settlement continually encroaching upon those lands, so the natives desperately wanted to reclaim Ohio and Kentucky, which was their sacred hunting ground. The last part of the lesson is about the role of African Americans in the Revolution. Now, what's most important is African Americans would have many roles, and they would fight with both the British and the Continental Army, as well as with partisan groups, but most African Americans continued to be slaves. So most African Americans continued to work as slaves. However, there were African Americans that would fight with pretty much every group that was known and in every colony. Some fought with the British, though. And you can pretty much imagine what the British promised African Americans if they fight for them. Yes, they said, "We will set you free." Of course, these slaves, these African Americans, they were disappointed when the British lost. So that promise went by the wayside. Now, some African Americans would fight with the groups that hid in the woods. What were they called? Yes, they were called the partisans. Some fought with them. Some also fought in the major army headed up by George Washington called the Continental Army. Now, as far as the colonial militias go, South Carolina says no way to allowing African Americans to fight in their colonial militia and their divisions of the Continental Army. And the reason was simple. Ever since Stono Rebellion, there was no arming of slaves with guns because they feared they might rebel. Now, later, South Carolina did allow slaves to fight in their sections of the Continental Army. Later, they said 1/3 of them can serve, but no guns. They can do non-combat roles with no guns. They can do things like cooks. They can help build the ramparts, or which is just a word for saying like the fortifications of the armies. They could help build buildings and forts, but no guns whatsoever. So once again, a show of the fear of those living in the Carolinas that the slaves might rebel if they have guns. So, to reinforce what was already said, African Americans most continued to work on the plantations as slaves. And the main reason is because they were needed to grow the cash crops. However, owners definitely feared giving the Africans guns and weapons because they feared slave uprisings if they were armed. And they rejected the Continental Congress's appeal to let them serve non-military jobs. Because at first, the Continental Congress is like, well, just let them be cooks and things. At first, they said no, but they later changed to allow 1/3 of the militia to be made up of slaves, but not allowed to serve as soldiers. Africans, though, they would serve in an unofficial capacity with the partisan bands, And the South Carolina and the Continental Army, they did not offer freedom for fighting to slaves that would. And some Africans, once again, fought with the British because they were promised freedom when the British won the war. However, the British lost and they were disappointed. From my own personal research, like I said, African Americans, there was also African Americans fighting in this battle here where my it's about 5 great-grandma was here, and she became famous, at least in the part of Ohio I'm from. So, African Americans were also fighting Native Americans on the front against the Native American allies of the British. In the next lesson, we will learn more about the Revolutionary War battles that were fought in the Carolinas and about the end of the war. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.